Good afternoon, everyone. If you are in the atrium, in the hallway, and you hear my voice, come to my voice because I have treats and I'm very charming. So you want to come here and listen to what I say because I have free bags. Yay! Woo! Anyone want some free bags? Yeah, okay. I'm not going to throw it out. I was going to do it, and it just seems a little inappropriate. Woo! Okay. In all seriousness, I want to welcome folks back. All right, I think we're good. We're good. I got everyone's attention. There we go. All right. Okay. I want to welcome everybody back here, and thank you all for a wonderful day. My name is Kimberly Chen. I'm our government affairs manager, and it's just been a privilege to be with you all today from the morning through the workshops and now here. And before we close with our last plenary here, I want to remind you all that we all want to get better, and one of the best parts of getting better is getting great feedback. And you know how we get great feedback? From you all. So please fill out your evaluation forms. Yay! No one wants to do it. It's fine. It's okay. She already did it. You get a bag. Yeah. Oh, you already got All right. In all seriousness, I think we heard so much this morning about the moment we're in terms of our politics, of our democracy in our society, and what's at stake. Throughout the workshops today, we've had the opportunity to deep dive into different areas that we care about, from the Affordable Care Act and what is next for it, to mental health, to oral health, to addressing our traumas, and to looking at the very environments that are built around us that foster or block us from getting better health. And to close out our conversation here today, I want to welcome our closing plenary. And these folks will be talking about what's next. How do we take the things that we've talked about here and really take them to action? What messages do we do to use to get to folks, to get them to take action, whatever that may look like, whether that's voting, whether that's engaging their neighbors, and maybe running for office themselves, and who are folks doing that work right now. So I want to turn it over now to Doretha, our board member and the executive director of the California Black Health Network, who will be facilitating this conversation. Doretha.
Good afternoon. I'm going to start by introducing our speakers today. Jonathan Tran, Sacramento Program Manager of the California Endowment. He will discuss work on civic engagement and why voting is important for health. Veronica Carrizales, Policy and Campaign Development Director at California Calls. She will discuss statewide work and the relationship with local organizations. We have Lucas Zucker, yes? Okay, Policy and Communications Director at the Central Coast Alliance for a Sustainable Economy, CAUSE. He will discuss local work and specific target issues in EJ and in economic justice. Felix Huang, thank you. Training Director, Strategic Concepts and Organizing and Policy Education at Scope. We'll discuss local work and specific work building, community capacity, interactions with California Calls, and ecosystems of civic engagement. And I am, again, Doretha Williams-Flournoy from the California Black Health Network. And last year, we hosted a series of town hall meetings where we discussed the vision and best practices that Black folks have around their health and well-being. And it was evident to me that we could dream all that we want, but if we don't vote, it means nothing, right? So what is your organization doing to translate ideas into messages, campaigns, and votes? And we'll start out with you, John.
Sounds good. Good afternoon, everyone. How's everyone doing? Excellent. First of all, I want to say thanks. It's wonderful to be back among friends. I think I spent 6 years as an advocate with CRAC, fighting alongside you, trying to implement the ACA. So it's a tremendous privilege to be back in this space and among advocates, and to be on a panel full of organizers is pretty sweet. Um, so to the question about what is your organization doing in terms of addressing civic participation and voting? So at the California Endowment, we fundamentally believe that voting is an essential and critical part of community health. That we can work on the various outcomes and social outcomes, that we can work on improving or reducing the amount of soda folks consume, and we can improve our communities, and we can do what it takes. But unless we institutionalize it, right? Unless we transform the institutions that create those disparities in the first place, that the individuals themselves, residents and community members, will not have agency over the change they hope to see. And so fundamentally, we see voting as a critical piece of community and building community health. And so in looking at it that lens, I kind of reflect back to my ACA implementation days, right? So now that we're back in Los Angeles, and then usually in every major city, if at around like 10 o'clock, 10 a.m. in the morning, you'll always see like a gathering of like elders, usually from immigrant communities, usually from communities of color. They're gathering up and they're all waiting for a bus to come pick them up, right? And the bus that's coming to pick them up is usually to a casino, right? So one of the models that we always talked about was about how casinos were so damn effective and so culturally competent at reaching our community, right? And so I kind of look at the way we do outreach in terms of encouraging people to vote. I wish we had the same type of resources as a casino, but that being said, it's looking at some of the lenses that they use, right? So first of all, they address communities where they're at, right? Usually it's a transportation problem or communities not really understanding how to get to the polls and participate in government, right? For casinos, they fix that problem. They will literally pick you up and drive you to the casino, right? So as communities or as organizations, what are we doing to improve the capacity of our organizations to get folks in our communities to the polls? Or better yet, how do we go directly to them through vote by mail, right? So that's one element. The other element is also addressing what community needs, right? So a lot of folks that are being picked up oftentimes comes from low-income families. They have nutrition needs, food needs. And so what do casinos do? Not only do you gamble there, but if you gamble there, they give you a food voucher to feed you while you're there, right? And everything that they provide is translated. They talk to you in language. All their advertising is in language, right? So the lesson from our lens is that we need to start speaking the language of what our communities are coming from. So a lot of this, and we'll dive into it in terms of like how you shape the narrative about how we mobilize our communities, is first of all just simply listening, right? And being able to make sure and empower communities to share their own voices and share their own stories and acknowledge where folks are at. And a big part of what we're looking at the endowment is also looking at kind of the skill set and capacity of folks, right? Give and meet folks where they're at in terms of their needs. So if I wanted to do a paid media buy, the California Endowment, like our Health for All campaign, obviously, has had a lot of success in terms of getting the message out there, along with the help and support of organizations. But if you ask the regular community-based organizations, how do you pull off a paid media buy, right? How many organizations have the capacity to do that? And usually when you need to do that, you're also asking outside consultants, right? Usually folks that are not from communities of color, not from immigrant populations, and usually you're going to the ALA or the Bay Area to make that happen, right? So how do we begin to build the capacity so that organizations keep those resources, keep that talent about telling their stories in-house? But we'll dive into more questions and we'll keep going.
Well, I almost feel it's not.
Right.
It is. Oh, okay. I almost feel like I should throw out my talking points about building power and talk a little bit more about casinos. But just to say a little bit about my organization. So I work with California Calls. We're a statewide alliance of community-based organizations. And, you know, we came together because we were seeing budget cuts happening at the statewide level, and we were constantly reacting to the budget cuts, right? And so we came together because we wanted to build power for the community groups that were part of our alliance, and we wanted to push forward a progressive agenda. And the building power part is a part that I want to talk to you about today. And I have the pleasure to sit here on the panel with two representatives from some of the anchor groups that we work with that'll have the opportunity to give you some examples of how we're doing that at the local level. But on the building power part, one of the key pieces for us was changing the demographics of who votes in California. So if we look at who the California population is, right? 40% of the population is white, but 65% of the likely voters, so these are the voters that are likely to turn out to vote, are white, right? So what's happening, right? The likely voter is more white, is affluent, they're older, and they're more conservative. And so when we think about having power and having a say in key decisions that impact our lives, and we know here in California, a lot of decisions are made through the initiative process, right? And so when we think about how do we ensure that our communities have a say, a big part of that is making sure that they're turning out to vote. And so one of our strategies as California Calls was to reach out to, low-income communities of color, to reach out to immigrants, to reach out to women, to make sure that they were turning out in greater numbers, because we needed to change the demographics of who votes, and we needed to build power in our communities and for our communities. This has involved a multi-year strategy to increase voter participation of folks that are most impacted. So we knew from the beginning that this would involve a multi-year strategy. It would involve an investment in infrastructure. So as a statewide alliance, we invested in a predictive dialing system statewide so that all of our anchor groups have access to the predictive dialing system and are able to reach voters, not just in the thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands. And later in the presentation, I'll talk about the impact that we've had. We also have used what's called an integrated voter engagement approach. And this is about reaching out to voters, not just during election cycles, right? So how many of you get a call from the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or somebody, right, during elections, right? We all get calls during election cycles, but then after the elections, we don't hear from them. And so this is about building relationships with voters during election cycles, but also during non-election cycles, and about talking to voters about key issues that impact their communities, whether it be immigration, whether it be schools, whether it be criminal justice reform issues. We want to make sure that we're having real conversations about real issues that affect their communities. And our strategy has also been about having community-based organizations lead the work. And in the presentation, we'll have an opportunity to talk more about that. Thank you.
Hi everyone, my name is Lucas Zucker. I'm the Policy Director at CAUSE, Central Coast Alliance United for a Sustainable Economy. We're an organization that works to advance social, economic, and environmental justice in California's Central Coast, specifically Ventura and Santa Barbara counties. And so I love being on this panel because I can talk about whatever I want to talk about because we're at a conference about health equity and we're on a panel about civic engagement, and those two things seem like very specific things, but they're actually things that basically just touch everything, because all civic engagement and voting is getting folks to be willing and inspired to take action, right? And to not just take action, but to take time out of their own stressful and crazy and busy individual lives to be a little part of something bigger than themselves, right? And believe that larger movement can achieve something. And health equity is about people being willing to organize and hold in the power of that my and the people I love, their bodies and minds and their well-being matters, and that their lives matter, right? And that those things matter more than whatever's kind of the kind of greed or profit out there, right? And that we need to value those things. And so our work, although it might not always be kind of specifically around health equity or around voting, is always touching those things, right? So a few examples. We, over the last 4 years, worked to successfully stop the Puente power plant, a power plant that was proposed in the city of Oxnard. Oxnard has all of the power plants for the county of Ventura. kind of a classic pattern. Oxnard's 85% people of color. A lot of the heavy industry and most polluting facilities have been concentrated there historically. And so the community was really fed up. Largest power plant company in the world, NRG, proposed another power plant there. Hundreds of people turning out to hearing after hearing after hearing over several years, right? Really feeling like they were coming out there and policymakers weren't listening to them. Kind of making these rational arguments about, is it fair that this many power plants in this city versus, this energy supply? And I think really what turned around that campaign was a simplification and a sharpening of that message. And so instead of kind of, this kind of wonky stuff around coastal protection and energy policy, we brought it down to something simple as Oxnard deserves clean air. It was that simple, right? This is a city with among the highest asthma rates in the state of California as a result of the agricultural pesticides, the industrial pollution there. And so said clean air for Oxnard, right? And that kind of bolder tactic and sharper message was really what turned around that campaign and allowed us to, for a working class immigrant community, to defeat this huge multi-billion-dollar corporation. Right? Another example, we work a lot on labor issues, particularly around farm worker rights issues. Farm workers are exposed to incredibly toxic chemicals at work through high levels of pesticides. We're especially in the strawberry industry in our region, and that's always tops that list of dirty dozen when you look at the fruits and vegetables that you're not supposed to eat as a consumer. Well, if you think about communities where strawberries are grown, if strawberries at the top of the dirty dozen list, what does that mean for the neighborhoods and people that work there? And then think about the way the policy choices, right, and legislative and electoral decisions impact those. So for example, since the New Deal era, farm workers were excluded from overtime protections that all other workers were given, right? And this was rooted in racial inequality. It was farm workers and domestic workers that at the time historically were black workers, right? During that New Deal era, that was also the Jim Crow era, right? And so farm workers were excluded. And so we worked a lot on mobilizing folks to oppose to pass the bill in California that passed a couple years ago and will be coming into effect over the next few years to grant farm workers equal rights to overtime as all other workers. And so it's another place where it seems like a labor issue, but it's also, how many hours in a day is someone stooped over in sweltering heat exposed to toxic chemicals, right? Another example is our work around housing, right? And affordable housing and tenants' rights. And so within our region, we've got a lot of kind of rural communities, but we also have one incredibly expensive community, Santa Barbara, which many of you may have gone on vacation there, or but interestingly, it's a place that has extremely high cost of living, extremely high cost of land, but actually very low wage jobs. When you think about what jobs are in the tourism industry, right? It's people who work in the back of the house of kitchens, right? It's people who clean hotel rooms, right? And those folks have to find a way to survive and make ends meet. And so they've got, so we have organized tenants in Santa Barbara around affordable housing, around the basic conditions of housing, and to fight against unfair evictions, against basic habitability of housing and for the supply of affordable housing. And so that too, someone having a roof over their head, not having to spend, an hour commuting every day to work from a far away, cheaper place, right? That's about health equity, and it's also about civic engagement.
Thank you. Go ahead. Felix?
Sure. And upfront, I'll just say real quick. So I'm part of the training component at Scope, which means that in addition to supporting our own base building, our own campaign work, part of what I get to do is do capacity building and strategy development with different social justice nonprofits, labor unions, and some legislative staff all across the U.S. So, and definitely appreciate that as a learning opportunity for us as well. So just to say, what I'll be sharing will be, in addition to reflections on Scope's own work, reflections on some of the things more broadly as well. Okay, so with that being said, how many of you have ever gotten together with a bunch of your friends and confronted a bully before? Okay. How many of you have ever gotten together with a bunch of your coworkers and confronted a boss, an owner, a manager before? Okay. How many of you have ever gotten together with some fellow tenants, fellow neighbors to confront a greedy landlord or a developer? Okay. How many of you have ever filled out a ballot and slid it into a box or slid it into an envelope? Of those things, which was more exhilarating? Which one felt more like an exercise of power?
Confronting the landlord seems like it would be much more.
Yeah.
Hell yeah, it does. Yeah. So I think that goes to show that with voter engagement, which is very important, in addition to what Veronica was bringing in terms of integrated voter engagement, engaging folks not only in November, but through the rest of the time, and that's a integration across time. There's also integration across tactics as well. So thinking about and taking collective action, right? Because voting is a very individualized act. A lot of times it's kept private who you're voting for. Not so much these days with social media, but then you're doing it on your own more or less, or maybe with a friend or two. But you're not necessarily taking that collective action and confronting the person who has the power. So some cautions with voting would be that you're usually putting things into a very rigid system. You're choosing between predetermined choices, and oftentimes you have to hold your nose while you make a decision. You're not deciding on something that necessarily comes from your community, or maybe at the start came from the community, but through the process of getting to the ballot box, if it's a proposition or something, or if it's legislation that you're calling your legislator for, through that process of contact with lobbyists and whatnot, isn't really what you set out for anymore. So with that, Scope just came back Monday night from San Francisco. Does anyone know what's going on in San Francisco this week? Climate Change Summit. So right now is Governor Jerry Brown's Global Climate Action Summit, which sounds good, right? Action needs to be done about the climate. But Scope, along with CAUSE and other organizations, we went up in a bus with CPE, Communities for a Better Environment, based out of the Southeast cities. We were going not to go participate in the GCAS, the Global Climate Action Summit, but we were going to go up there to confront Governor Brown, because the things that Governor Brown is there to talk about and the people that he's there to talk with are false solutions, are not what we need. He's up there presenting himself as the climate governor, just as our mayor here in LA presents himself as the climate mayor. But they're out there, invite only, talking to the people who already have power, and then maybe inviting a few people here and there who don't belong to the corporate class, just to say that they did it. So we went up there to confront these false solutions, and these false solutions are what happens when you enter into a predetermined game with rigged rules, existing power structure relationships that you have to come up against. So with that, then we have to understand voting within an ecosystem, that it can't be the only course of action, that it is a necessary course of action, but wholly insufficient. So so in confronting the governor, we took 10 staff and then 10 of our members, so South LA resident leaders, who are deeply involved, many of them deeply involved in our civic engagement work, yes. And then also they felt a different kind of thrill outside of the fancy hotel where Jerry Brown was meeting with his corporate friends to figure out how they were going to commodify the air we breathe through cap and trade, figure out how they were going to commodify the forests in South America that are largely stewarded by indigenous folks, how they were going to move these pieces around, recognizing that something needs to be done about climate, but that they were going to do it ultimately for their own gain at the expense of indigenous folks in South America, indigenous folks everywhere, at the expense of communities of color here, where they'll continue to pollute, by the right to continue to pollute by schools and hospitals and neighborhoods. And we recognize that these things are false solutions. So I'll say more later on a little bit about the relationship of voting to that. But
You know, Felix, it's interesting that you would mention this perception of the system being rigged. We held the series of town hall meetings, and we went from city to city, and we often heard this sense of disappointment, discouragement, not trusting the system, because folks had witnessed, you know, some significant gains around equity and health equity issues, you know, through the federal government and here in the state of California. And, you know, they saw the election of the first Black president. And then, you know, we saw this big election with, you know, the first possible woman, you know, being elected into the office of president. And then something happened very different than the expectation of the people on the ground. And now we're witnessing the erosion of all of that, in addition to some of the safety and security that we felt as people of color being able to even just walk the streets. And so folks are pretty disillusioned out there. And so when you're out there trying to get people to vote, you're trying to message and get people interested in the political system. And how do you shift the narrative on policy and civic engagement messages? Veronica, Lucas, Felix, if you could answer those for me, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, I'll start. So I want to talk a little bit about how I think that our opponents often use fear-based messages, right? The oil and gas industry will spend millions of dollars telling you that if you don't, approve their projects, then you're gonna be unemployed and poor, right? If you don't let the landlords do whatever they want, then there's going to be a shortage of housing, right? And nobody will want to build housing anymore because the landlords can't raise the rent on you or whatever, right? That if you try to pass worker protections, then there'll be no jobs for anyone, and if you pass immigrants' rights protections, then there'll be criminals running the street everywhere, and we'll be in chaos, and you're gonna die and be shot by an immigrant, right? And so that fear-based message is everywhere, right? And it's got so much resources behind it, like the casino. And so often, we respond sometimes with our own fear-based, right? Our own fear-based message is, if we don't pass this immigrants' rights protection, you're going to get deported, right? If we let these oil companies build this, you're going to get asthma, right? Or your kid's going to get asthma. If we don't pass this renter protection, you're going to get evicted. And there's real power in that. The reason we do that, and I'm as guilty of it as anybody, right? I mean, I do communications work, I write raps and scripts and all kinds of communications materials, and I'm totally guilty of this because it works, right? It really does work at mobilizing our folks and getting them out to the polls, but it works in the short run, right? And it works in the short run because there's truth in it, because there's truth that there are very real threats facing our people, right? That people are afraid of, and they should be. But the reason it doesn't work in the long run is that people begin to get fatigued, right? They get trauma fatigue. And there's so much coming at them from basically all sides are telling them all these bad things are going to happen to you, that people disengage. They pull away, and their impulse is, I need to just protect my own. I don't want to engage in this big systemic stuff. I want to protect myself and my family, right? And so over the long run, it erodes people's actual participation. It erodes people's actually, hope and inspiration. And that's a real problem for our message, right? And our movement. And so how do we shift that towards something different, right? Towards something that is actually inspiring people to get out there, not because they're kind of afraid of what's going to happen. The truth is they already know that, right? They already know the real threats facing them and their loved ones. What they don't know is that there's a possibility for something different. What they don't know is that if they organize to confront that bully, right, that they can win, that they can beat their landlord, they can beat their boss, and actually achieve the basic needs that we have to protect our own health, our lives, our dignity, right? And that's the kind of message that we need.
That's good. You know, I think one of the, so Lucas was doing a good job talking about how sometimes we make the mistake of focusing on fear-based messaging. And then other times we make the mistake of focusing on what the polls say, right? So we're, and that's part of the problem sometimes, is that we're not talking about real issues that affect people's everyday lives. We're basing it on what the polls are telling us to say, because at the end of the day, we want to win, right? We want to win on an initiative. We want to win on an issue. And that holds us back from being real about what's happening. And so I want to give the example of a very wonky topic, which is commercial property tax reform, to add, to make this conversation more exciting. But you know, when we started talking to folks about this campaign, which is, you know, around reforming Prop 13 and reforming the commercial property side of it, we were talking about it through the lens of commercial property tax reform, right? We were saying, we're going to do this wonderful thing. We're going to reform commercial properties, and this is part of Prop 13. And we were doing that because the polls told us that voters didn't understand that there was a distinction between residential and commercial. Voters didn't understand what the impact would be. And so we thought if we just explained the policy, that we would get voters to understand. We did some polling and some focus groups, and that told us that we should be talking about the issue through this lens of make it fair. And so then we switched our polling and our messaging, and we started talking about, well, we need to make it fair. We need to make sure corporations are paying their fair share, because corporations are causing problems in our community. You know, we don't have enough money for our schools, enough money for our streets. And so we did a big campaign around Make It Fair. And I was very proud of that campaign. but, you know, a lot of it was being pushed by the focus groups, right? By the polling, by the messaging, right? And our organizers on the ground, right? Lucas and other organizers on the ground were saying, hey, the messaging isn't working. The messaging is not working for us. I remember we were doing a lot of organizing, and I remember one thing in particular. We did a series of town halls, and I remember I was driving to a town hall in San Bernardino, and as I was driving to that town hall, it was located in this church. I was driving down there, and I was driving down this street that was full of potholes. I'm looking at the houses in the neighborhood, and some of the houses are shuttered up because of foreclosures, or people have moved out. The bus stop is falling apart. You know, you see, you know, you just see that you see the streets are kind of dirty, like they haven't been cleaned on a regular basis. And I'm driving down there, and I'm feeling like this is, and we had started talking about this narrative. This issue is about disinvestment, right? This issue and this issue is about the impact disinvestment has had on our communities. And sometimes we get so stuck on the policy side, on the wonky side, and I do that myself because I'm a policy wonk myself, but you have to go back to what the real impact is on people's lives. And so when we're talking about taxes, wonky topics like taxes, what we're really talking about are what the impact is on people's lives when disinvestment happens, right? And so driving down to that town hall in San Bernardino, it was the disinvestment that created that situation, the disinvestment that was created by corporations not paying their fair share, right? So part of it is being able to base the story and the messaging on people's everyday experiences. It's also about crafting messages based on the values that people have, right? So the values of hope, right? And so when we talk about the winning message, right, what it's going to take, it's going to take all of us coming together. And now our campaign is schools and communities first. And so I feel like we're finally talking about what we really want, the values that we want. And the values are around putting our schools and our communities first, so that we have the key services that we need in our communities. But it took some steps to get there, and it's not easy, because you have different messages that you're receiving when you're on a campaign, right? You have the polling messages, you have the campaign consultants, you have the organizers, And so it took some work, but I think like we're finally there.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to that is that, so one of the things we do at the endowment is that we track like online conversations. So part of understanding and trying to change the part of changing the narrative is also understanding what's out there, right? So in addition to a tactic of fear, the other layer that the opposition is using is a tactic of noise, right? The idea that if you constantly bombard people with every day in the news cycle, it's a new topic, a new issue, that ultimately people will tune out, right? Like you all described, that you actually disengage from the conversation because either one, you don't know how to enter it, or then two, you have no way of impacting, right? So it goes back to the idea of being able to ground it and root it in something tangible that people see on a daily basis, I think is what you can do to address and cut through the noise. Is that if you meet people where they're at, talk about the issues that are core to them, and localize it, because I think that's the only way to avoid getting into the trap of the noise. And we fall into that trap all the time because as communities, we have to respond, right? Like, how do you not respond to the chaos out there? So it takes a lot of discipline to say schools and communities first, and that's what we're working on because that's what the people need, right? The other layer, and I like hate promoting like casinos, but I think they cracked the code, is like the bring a friend coupon, right? Like the peer-to-peer outreach is the most and only conclusive like form of motivation that we have in like the campaign world. Like the 2016 like election threw everything out the door in terms of what we thought we knew, right? One of the things that came out of it was the idea of peer-to-peer mobilization as the core component of actually turning out communities that historically don't turn out, right? So the idea that you bring a coupon, you bring a friend, you both get a gift as a byproduct of it, right? Looking at civic participation as a peer-to-peer motivation strategy, I think has to be something that's ingrained in us. That we need to not only turn out like the people, we need to turn out our family members, right? We need to turn out the folks right next door to us in order to win, because it's the relational motivation, I think, that needs to cut across, get through the noise, and really push folks past that despair that I think a lot of folks have.
I kind of like this casino, analogy that we're using here. And so, if I were going to go to the casino and I really liked it, I thought it was a great place and I won some money and I wanted my friends, I'd bring a whole bunch of people with me, right? What do you do in the messaging world? What do you do in this civic engagement world? How do you know that your message is resonating with the folks that you're talking to? Is it only the polls that we can judge that by? What do you do? How do you know?
Well, I would take it in a slightly different direction.
Okay.
So kind of building off of what folks have raised, every election, no matter where you are, one party always wins, and that's the people who don't vote. And we know from polling that generally they're people of color, generally they're poor and working class folks, and generally politically they're to the left of a lot of the people who do vote. And so when we go door knocking or whatnot, the reason that people say they don't vote is because they say, well, tomorrow morning, it ain't going to make a difference for me. And in many ways, they're absolutely right. So in terms of messaging, is placing it in context. So for us, with this integrated voter engagement model, part of it involves neighbors talking to neighbors. Many of our resident members are the folks who are doing the calling, doing the door knocking. And then also importantly, voting for us is secondary to the organizing. It's part of the organizing for sure, but it's secondary to it because this is the chance to make contact with folks. You have data, you have a very concrete thing to go to the door to, but then you're also being like, hey, well, yeah, voting alone isn't going to make a difference, but if you get organized with your neighbors, if you come either join us or some other organizing group, we can continue to push for change, the kind of change that we need, the kind of change that happens beyond the ballot box. So with that, I think one measure is like, how's your message resonating with people? And then we can also flip that and see voting as a reflection of your organizing as well, not only in terms of the turnout, but in terms of what you put on the ballot. And I'll try to be quick. I think one example of that is the housing justice movement in LA and in California. So right now, as we're gearing up for election season, many of the California cause groups are going to be doing work around Proposition 10, which is to repeal Costa-Hawkins, which is basically a ban on real rent control. So that's a very significant thing for the housing justice movement. How we got to this point where this thing, Yes on 10, is on the ballot is a long story, but I'll try to be short with it, is that it took a whole ecosystem of people in the housing justice movement, including internal conflicts. For example, here in LA, deep conflict around Measure S, deep conflict around JJJ. But this is, you had a whole bunch of different folks. You had affordable housing developers, you had the traditional nonprofits, you know, the ELACs, the SAGEs of the world. And then you also had much more autonomous groups like the LA Tenants Union, like Defend Boyle Heights. So people who don't take any foundation money, people who are primarily volunteer run, excuse me, if not all volunteer run. And within this ecosystem, within this conflict, whether directly or indirectly, people had to force clarity in their stance, in their issues. And finally, after much organizing, which involves everything from building by building organizing, confronting developers, going on rent strikes, which are still going on out here in LA all over right now, and it's growing, it's contagious. Yes on 10 is a reflection of that organizing. So whether or not we win in November, getting to the ballot, getting to this point is a reflection of that organizing, where people built a strong enough infrastructure independent of the electoral structure that by the time you get to the electoral structure, you're pulling in the other people. You're not getting pulled along by other people. So I think very key is to build that infrastructure, that organizing infrastructure, independent of the electoral work before you engage the electoral work, because otherwise you just get eaten up.
This may sound weird coming from a funder, but I think an overdependence on the numbers, right? Be able to have to hit your target numbers all the time is actually an unhealthy practice in terms of actually building tangible power. So for the funders in the room, I think the challenge is getting past like what we observe as what are tangible outcomes, right? Because the reality is that I think you can have tremendous impact even if you're developing a small group, right? And a small, powerful group of people can transform anything and transform the country and transform the world as we're seeing it now, right? They just happen to have a ton more resources. But the reality is that I think the over-reliance on saying, okay, well, we need to move like X thousand of folks, we need to follow the polls, win this ballot initiative, I think isn't a long-term strategy. And I think the more we can get away from that mindset is healthier, I think, for our communities in terms of building something sustainable.
Okay, last question. What about those folks who are not eligible to vote? Is there a role for them in this process? What do we do?
I'd love to take this question as we do a ton of canvassing, get out the vote work, and actually probably the majority of the people who are members, grassroots leaders of cause, and knock on doors, get out the vote, can't vote themselves. They're either youth who are under 18 or they're undocumented. And so, and this is not unique to cause. There are other organizations in California Cause who their whole team of folks of canvassers are all formerly incarcerated people who most of them can't vote either, right? So why is this? Why would people actually be not only inspired to do that work, but actually even maybe more inspired than someone who is able to vote, right? I think one of the reasons is that I actually think, as Felix kind of talked about earlier, voting itself as an individual act is really not that empowering, right? It's like actually not that empowering as one person to go like, okay, I turned in my one vote, and like now out of the millions and millions of people in California, that candidate won by 500,000 and my one vote was part of that 500,000. Like that's actually not that inspiring, right? But what is really empowering is I am going to be part of this movement to get my whole community out to vote, right? And for my whole community to be represented, for people who look like me, who I never see up on that podium, right, to be represented. For me to go and knock on my neighborhood, which has the worst schools in the city, the most pollution in the city, the worst jobs in the city, right? The least healthcare access in the city. And we're going to together get our whole community out to vote. And I'm going to knock on doors and I'm going to hear people's stories and I'm going to talk to them. And in the process, I'm going to build these connections and relationships with my neighbors, my friends, my loved ones, right? That's real power. That's real inspiration. And so for someone who can't vote themselves, I always tell people, look, if you can't vote, that's one less vote. You could spend a whole election season talking to hundreds of people and getting hundreds of people in your community out to vote. That's way more powerful than if you could vote yourself. Those people who are just voting for themselves, they're totally not as powerful as you, right? And I think that's what people feel, and that's why the majority of the folks who do the work in cause to get their communities out to vote actually can't vote themselves because they see that power.
Great. Well, we have to wrap, and I'm just going to ask you for a closing statement. If you were to make a prediction for the midterm elections, what would that be? Or maybe your hope, your greatest hope. You could do it that way too. I'll let you off there.
Well, I think in California we're going to turn over some key congressional seats. So I think that'll be something big that we do as part of the midterm election. There are a number of initiatives on the ballot that deal with housing. Some of them are actually true solutions around housing, like the housing bonds and the Costa-Hawkins repeal. And one of them is not a true solution. It's actually an initiative that was put forward by the realtors, which is Proposition 5. And so I feel confident that together as a movement that we will defeat it, and that we will win greater investments around housing. And so I think more than just the outcomes of the midterm election, I think that it's an opportunity for us to do what we've been talking about, right? Is continue to build power for our communities, continue to do collective organizing, and know that it's not just the midterm election, but it's actually building for the long term, right? And so keeping in our minds that we have to have a multi-year approach to winning progressive policy reforms here in California. And we can only do that if we're building a statewide movement. And so I think for us, it's staying focused on the building and staying focused on building power for us statewide.
We're a 501c3 foundation, so we can't officially take positions on candidates. My greatest hope is that we have unprecedented turnout among young people in the state of California. The numbers are there. The numbers are there in terms of record registration among young people participating, even though they know like the system is rigged, like they still have to be part of it. And that mindset is so transformational that in order to change the rigged system, you have to break it down, right? Both from the outside and the inside. And I think that narrative is beginning to take hold. The other hope is that you have unprecedented turnout in California's Central Valley, communities that are disproportionately impacted by health disparities, but are turning out, and the level of organizing in the Central Valley is tremendous. So anybody that says there's no capacity in the Valley isn't paying attention, because those folks are working their asses off, and I think it's going to pay off from here on out.
Yeah, well, I'll maybe bring a view from a local grassroots organization that does a lot of work in little towns that many of you have maybe never heard of, and say that I think we're you see all the big stuff on national news, but reporting from little communities, school boards, and city councils, I think we have never seen this many young people, this many true progressives, this many people of color, this many women running for office. And often, actually, I think where you first see that wave is at this small local level. It takes a long time to get the first Black president, right? But at that local level of who's running for your school board, I think we have never seen this level of energy and this level of really incredible people running for office. And I think that is going to lead to this wave of change, not just now but 20, 30 years from now, as we see the long-term effects of this kind of wave of progressive candidates that are running right now, and all the people, grassroots folks who are knocking doors on their campaigns and are inspired by this.
I think my prediction is that whatever happens in 2018 after the midterms, if the people who take power, even if they are our allies or progressives or whatnot, if they don't use that power to reshape the relationship between their positions and the people, that nothing is going to change. So whatever happens in 2018, which is important for sure, because the terrain on which we organize is deeply affected by what happens at the ballot box. But whatever happens, the next day we're still going to have to organize door by door, block by block, building by building, workplace by workplace, because the transfer of power from the few to the many is not going to happen at the ballot box alone.
Wow.
Great.
Join me in thanking Jonathan and Veronica, Lucas, and Felix. Yes? Do we have time for questions or no? Any questions? No more casino analogies or anybody got numbers you want to run or no? Okay. Well, we'll turn it back.
Thank you all so much. One more hand for our closing plenary. Well, all right. I think we're about to wrap things down. And I'm going to give to Sarah because she looks like she has some notes.
So I'm so glad that you all went last, because while the room may be a little smaller, thank you all for staying. That I feel like what I heard today coming away from this are some really important points. Number one, that this is going to take hard, like this is not just about an election season, and this is not just about voting, that this is truly the relationships that we're building with our communities and how we're helping to transfer that power and how we're helping people to come into their own. And that is not a numbers-based game, right? That is a long-term, in the trend, like you have to be there a lot. You have to be there all the time. And so I also feel like I walked away with better messaging. Like, let's not stay in the fear-based messaging. Let's talk about what is the vision that we want to see going forward, and that actually comes from the community. And that's the folks that are often not at the table and not forming that vision. And so it's really incumbent upon us to be the ones who are creating that space at the table so that they can actually become a part of that vision. Taking risks, we have to take risks, right? We have to push ourselves. We may be really comfortable in what we're doing. We have to continue to push ourselves beyond what we think our capacity is, because the capacity is there and the need is even greater. And to continue to stand together. We can often get into a place of competition that sometimes we do limit in a world of limited resources in terms of kind of our space and where we're going. And so I think the other piece of coming away with this is to not get into that space, but that to continue to lift each other up. And if we see someone in need, to make sure that we're bringing them along with us. So again, I really want to thank you for going last, because I feel like you really put the tools and the messaging and the opportunity there for us in much more of a context of all the issues that we've been learning throughout the day. So again, I really want to thank you all so much. We're going to wrap it up here, and we have one final little fun thing to do for you all.